Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Babbling Irons episode today. And pretty interesting one around the West Ham Stadium, London Stadium. Something interesting could be happening, Mike. The 10-year penalty clause is now up. For people that don't know about that, it was kind of the concessionary agreement that was signed way back in 2013 for the stadium. That has now come to an end. So we'll get into kind of the details of that in a bit, but Mike, do you want to just kind of explain the overall breakdown from like a top level point of view of what this means and what it could potentially mean for the future of this football club?
Yeah, so obviously we signed the concessionary agreement in 2013, in which to take on a 99-year lease clause as one of two anchor tenants at the London Stadium. The other anchor tenant being the UK Athletics, who signed a 50-year agreement. So we entered into a much longer term, and we're paying around about £2 million to £2.5 million a year in terms of rental. During that time, there were some increases that obviously would come due to inflation and so on. But basically, we got a stadium for £2 million to £2.5 million a year, and didn't have to pay for anything in terms of the managing of the event, the arena during the actual matches itself. We were just renting the stadium, much as a performer would rent a concert hall like the O2. Yeah. Exactly the same principle. We weren't in charge of any of that operational cost. As part of the concessionary agreement, we also gave up other things such as some of our tickets price went to the LLDC. Some of our concessions pricing, also I think up to about 50%, also would go to the LLDC as part of the agreement. And should there have been any naming rights during that period, it would have been essentially a 50-50 split, I think, if it went over £4 million. Ultimately, during that period, we have seen no naming rights. But we can go into that in more details as we go along. But at a high level, that was the concessionary agreement that we agreed to. And those were the kind of stipulations that we had at the time. And obviously with the stadium potentially could be increased up to, say, 66 to 67,000 was also part of the agreement that it could also do that.
So what does this now mean in terms of the agreement coming to an end? Like, people, including myself, won't know too much about this. I know you've gone into a lot of research and detail around the whole thing. So in terms of the kind of the operational side and, West Ham playing at the London Stadium, that all stays intact, right? Regardless of this, or is there room for something else to happen there?
So there's always room. we can go into that in a bit. We'll probably deal that more at the end. But essentially, we've got a 99-year lease clause. So we are secure in the stadium. We have that for the next 99 years contractually. That is what it is as a tenant. Now, what it also means, now that the penalty clause is gone, there is no obligation for David Sullivan, any of the other board members, to now pay a subsidy to government when we sell. So as part of the concessionary agreement was up to, I think, 2-3 years ago, there was a 30% payment that West Ham had to pay on any sale of the club. In particular, if you went over certain thresholds, it would go up. So if it was the current value, I think, is 600 to 650 million based on what Krasinski paid for his 27% share. I think it's 27. Now, that would have meant they would have had to pay 30% or 20 to 30% on a full 650 million sale had they sold the club to Krasinski at that point.
Wow.
Now that clause has elapsed. There is now no obligation to make that payment. They are now free to sell West Ham without having to give government money back, because the whole point was that when West Ham came into the stadium, I think it was over a 10-year period as to when the contract was signed, which was obviously 2013, that once 10 years have elapsed, then West Ham wouldn't have to pay money back, because the view was that West Ham's value would increase due to the London Stadium and therefore would attract investors and so on. Therefore, the government wanted money back because they've given essentially West Ham a great equaliser and a great venue with already an outstanding legacy because of the 2012 Olympics.
So now, basically, there is no penalty. They are the owners now, David Sullivan mainly, is free to sell the football club without any kind of penalty or kind of...
Other than the tax man, that's it.
That's it. So Yeah, so he's basically not tied down to this stadium kind of agreement anymore. So in terms of the LLDC, can we just kind of talk a little bit more about that and how this will now move forward with the stadium? Because now there is no penalty, although we have the lease. What does this mean in terms of potential selling of the club and potential running of the operations on a match day and the day-to-day stuff at the London Stadium?
Yeah, so obviously the LLDC work with E20 to run the stadium. Now, West Ham have a very checkered past with both entities. It has improved in recent years, but it has been very checkered. One part of that was our self-inflicted, our own fans causing issues in the crowd after the move. Tempers were high because we weren't playing very well, and obviously the move wasn't very well managed. So that has been frayed in terms of on safety grounds. We have seen that improve in recent years because we've seen our attendance, also our capacity increase. Now, the issue that we currently have with the LLDC is that they are running and operating at a loss every season. They lose at this point between £8 to £10 million per year running the stadium. So the other thing is the state, the government, take the risk on the stadium. So they are, with the cost of inflation, obviously the energy increases because of what's been going on in Ukraine. They are having to deal with all of those issues in running the stadium. Obviously, West Ham rent that stadium technically for 19 games a season, plus additional cup games where we pay an extra fee. Now, what this is actually seen is in the past is a really big financial strain, not only on the LLDC, but E20. So as close as to 17-18 season, E20 were on the verge of going bankrupt.
Oh, wow.
Due to the running of the stadium. The stadium was almost making a bankrupt.
Is it common for that to happen at a football club, to kind of run a loss like that of 8 to 10 million a year?
I think some would say yes. There is, because obviously it's a large arena. You're paying for staff and so on, but you got to also remember they're only taking a portion of the gate
revenue from tickets,
and a portion of the concessions. Now, obviously they have other contracts with vendors within the stadium and so on, so they can do that. But ultimately, they've been poor commercially. We'll get into that in a bit, but there are reasons beyond that. As we said with E20, they almost went bust in 17-18 season. They take out a £40 million loan from taxpayers to remain solvent. And it was still looking like they could have gone out. They basically had a loss of £22 million in the 2018. So £22 million they were making as a loss. And one of those reasons was because when we first moved in, the conversion rates were so expensive. It was costing almost £11 million each summer to convert the stadium for London Athletics. For the UK Athletics.
Is that just to kind of move the seats around and stuff? Just that much?
So it cost them £11 million in the early years to host events. Now, UK Athletics was not pulling in anywhere near that kind of money to cover that conversion, to the point of when we was in COVID, they have, as part of their concession agreement, they have the right to host an event annually. Now, in 2019, they wanted to host an event at the London Stadium during COVID, and they were refused by the LLDC because they refused to pay the conversion costs, which have since subsequently dropped to £3 million. But they refused to do it because they said it wasn't economical. In the end, they preferred to pay the compensation of £2 million or 1.8 million to them, as opposed to actually hosting an event, because obviously the money it would have to take to pay people to be there, and obviously do the conversion. It just wasn't viable. So they were better off taking a £2 million hit than actually hosting an event, which just shows that how poorly managed the stadium is, how much of a drain financially it is. And obviously football has a much deeper set of pockets than UK Athletics. Now, if you look at over the course of the contract, so if you're saying 50 years, Athletics is going to be there at £3 million a year to convert over a 50-year period, you're looking at £150 million plus just in conversion fees for Athletics over 50 years. And that's on government to pay that. Is that sustainable? It doesn't sound it, does it? It really doesn't. And the reason I'm talking about this because this does start to build out as to why, one, the concessions agreement, or that penalty and concession agreement going is good. And two, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, again, this is the financial burdens that are being placed on government. And we're in a cost of living crisis where these financial burdens on taxpayers will not be looked upon as fairly as they have in the past. And in the London Assembly meeting, they were pretty forthright and pretty strong with the LLDC around certain aspects, such as one of those being that LLDC is still claiming that by 2034, they're still going to require public funding to the tune of about £5 million. And that's not even including the running of London Stadium. That's their own kind of back office operations and processes. They're going to still require £5 million worth of funding from government.
Yeah.
And, by that stage, the Olympics have been and gone. We had that in 2012. The LLDC has been around since then, and they're still going to need government funding up to then. So again, it's adding on that pressure of the London Legacy Development Committee, as it is, are in a position where they are going to have to look to find ways in which to generate money and to remove overheads. One of those potential removals of overhead was that in 2022, the UK Athletics were actually offered an out of the London Stadium.
Really?
According to the Telegraph, as part of a report on the stadium, they were offered a 10 to 15 million pound settlement to relocate. And the reason for that relocation is in 2022, the Commonwealth Games happened in the UK. So there's now a purpose-built athletics arena and location in the middle of Britain, in Birmingham, which again has been something that's been often talked about, especially with athletics, in that because it's such a wide and disparate kind of, athletes all over the country, that having a centralized place like Birmingham would be a good idea rather than London-centric, which is pretty much where all UK sports are based. So there is a very logical argument that it moves. So ultimately, anyone who is looking to come take the stadium, one of the conversations would be to go to the UK Athletics and essentially offer them a buyout. So rather than converting the stadium once a season, because they have a right due to their agreement, but buying them out of that contract. And if their 10 to 15 million pounds was considered fair, someone offers around that, potentially probably a little bit more, is what they're probably going to argue for. But if someone was to offer them 20 million pounds, there's every chance as a new owner of West Ham, you could remove the second anchor tenant.
Yeah.
Not only does that remove a financial burden for the likes of the LLDC, it also removes a potential revenue stream for the LLDC. So you weaken their position because you are essentially buying them out.
What does that mean kind of for West Ham then in our terms? Because right now we're just renting the stadium. All of this kind of stuff is happening around us while we're just playing football at this arena. It's very plausible that they would move up to the Commonwealth Arena, wherever that is in Birmingham, if they wanted to do the athletic stuff there instead of wasting money and converting the London Stadium as it is. But if that was to happen, what would that mean for the Olympic Stadium and West Ham in terms of just moving forwards?
Yeah, so if we remove athletics, you remove the need to have an athletics track. So what does that mean for West Ham is there is no reasonable argument to not reconfigure the stadium and not.
Is it available to do? Because a lot of the time in the past, people have said you can't bring the seats closer, you can't do this, can't do that. Would that be actually accessible to do?
You can't bring the seats closer in the current configuration of the stadium, in the current design of the stadium. Now, should athletics go, one of those reasons again is because you can't dig down because we can't pour up the athletics track, because they need the athletics track because they have the right to annually hold an event. Yeah. It's going to take longer to dig down and to do that potentially. So, and obviously be in the summer. So that's when it wouldn't be done in football season, it'd be done in the summer. So again, you remove their potential to do that. So you'd have to compensate them to go and relocate and rent another arena.
Yeah.
Now, if they're not there, all of a sudden you removed an obstacle as to what can be done in the summer and why it can't be done. Now, I've heard reasons before that there's still chemical waste, because it was a chemical waste location, and one that it put it below the water table, so there's potential for flooding and so on. But these are all conversations that have been had a long time ago. Things may be different now. There may be ways in which to do around it. But there's every chance now that that means that as a football club, you would have the ability to dig down, to then add a greater gradient, and then ensure that you can get fans closer to the pitch, which is something that people have been baying for a very long time and can improve. And also you could potentially reinstate or introduce proper retractable seating.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is going to cost huge money to do. But if you have the right ownership who are willing to do that, then you can have a true multi-purpose stadium with true retractable seating.
Yeah.
And if you look at what the likes of, say, the Bernabeu, what they've been doing this season in the reconfiguring of their stadium and what they've been doing to that stadium, if you haven't seen it, I thoroughly recommend you go look at their plans. It's incredible and astonishing. You can still work within a stadium and do these things. We may have to relocate for a season if we want to go all out.
Yeah.
But I think as fans, we would probably accept a season maybe away from the stadium if we got a purpose-built stadium that had a true gradient, put us right on top of the pitch, and gave us a chicken run on steroids, basically, which is what we could have if we're right on top. So it does have some really, really positive implications if they get out. Now,
so it's kind of a knock-on effect with everything that's happening at the moment. So what we've got at this point is that penalty clause is now up. What that could then lead to is the LLDC selling or, moving on, and the Olympic side of things going towards the Commonwealth area in Birmingham. That would then give us basically full ownership of the stadium for whoever the owner is at that point. And then they may choose to invest in the stadium and make it more of a football stadium because we wouldn't need the athletic side of things, and it could just become a football stadium. That's kind of the whole sequence of what could happen. And that sounds exciting. Obviously, like you mentioned, there are barriers to this. There are probably a lot of barriers and a lot of hypotheticals, even with the waste underneath, like digging down, that could be a potential issue. But again, we don't know enough to talk about that. But overall, it sounds like it's one step closer to moving away from the ownership or having a reason to hold on to the ownership of David Sullivan at West Ham. And it gives him one less reason to hold on to this football club from a financial point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are some incredible positive. If you want to review the stadium in the way we've talked about it, there are some very good positive movements or positive processes that can be done in which to bring the stadium in line with just football and then start the process of improving it for football. Part of that comes with the removal of athletics. It just has to be done. But the issues around it at this current point is obviously the LLDC and the E20 do manage and run. Now, what we saw with PAI, regardless of whether you believe they were true, imaginary, or whatever you think, the truth of the matter is they went directly to the the LLDC, and they got an agreement. So, as fake as an entity as it was, they got an agreement with the LLDC in the space of 6 months to a year, where West Ham have had 10 years in which to get something and have achieved nothing. So,
what was the agreement for?
The agreement was for them to control the stadium.
Right.
And to control the stadium and manage the park. That was what it was. So West Ham would actually take more of a financial burden and would also then have more financial control on certain things. So it was a symbiotic relationship between the two, which worked. Now, as I say, they managed that within the 6 month to 1 year period of talking behind closed doors as to what potentially could be done as they were building up to a bid for West Ham. West Ham have had 10 years currently. Now, what's interesting in the London Assembly was that it was discussed, not discussed, it was pointed out that it was agreed in the last London Assembly that the LLDC would supply West Ham with the information that PAI, or the principles in the agreement that they come up with PAI at a high level. So West Ham could understand that, and then obviously there could be an open, honest conversation. Now, there was agreement between LLDC and the London Assembly that would happen. It hasn't. Now, the reason being is because there is a legal dispute still between West Ham and the LLDC and E20. Now, interestingly, the legal dispute has been stated by the LLDC that they expect by June that to be resolved. Again, very timely. You have a legal dispute and financial problem, and you can't share the principles and the information that PAI arranged with you to control and manage the stadium.
Yeah.
But that is going to be resolved by June. So at the end of the season, when we are either a Premier League club or a Championship club, and obviously the Championship club, our rent goes, obviously. But if we are still a Premier League football club, we no longer have a penalty clause. We will have technically no legal restrictions or problems with the incumbent owners and regulators of the stadium. Therefore, anyone looking to buy the club can all of a sudden have access to what PAI had, because they're going to have that to West Ham. West Ham could share certain documents, obviously ones that are maybe not sealed through confidentiality, but they could then discuss with any new prospective owner, this are the terms that you can get with the LLDC. This is what you can do in which to work. Now, what's interesting is West Ham kind of put out that they were interested in working with the LLDC further to help with naming rights and to help with all of these things. In the London Assembly, it was very clearly and very bluntly put that this is simply not true. They've gone to West Ham. They have requested proposals to control West Ham to help with naming rights. And despite consistently reaching out to West Ham, bear in mind, been in a relationship with West Ham for over 10 years, they've received nothing. So they've never had an interest in owning the stadium, never had an interest in managing the stadium, apart from what they put out to the media, because that makes it look good on them, makes it look like the LLDC are not willing to work. As we see with consistently, there's always an element of a good show, but very little put up around that. So according to the London Assembly, which is available for anyone to watch, they stated that they've requested information for West Ham in which to control, to manage, and they've had nothing. So Brady's comments have been set to one side, and quite frankly, they're untrue. And if we also remember, when the PAI conversation came up, Sullivan said that it was purely a real estate grab. Now, you can't develop in the London Stadium area. So the confines of the park is an urban park. You cannot develop in that area. There are other plots around the London Stadium that was part of the original London Legacy documentation and so on, where you can. So there are possibilities, such as like the MSG is one example of a location close to the stadium that could be developed.
Yeah.
Now, yes, there are real estate opportunities, which again will be very appealing to any new prospective owner, because not only do they have the stadium, if they can operate the park, there are consistent revenue activities. If you have land that you can build on, you can do things such as build restaurants, build hotels, put things in and around the park to keep people at the park or at West Ham after a game, bring them in other times. Again, 365 days a year revenue opportunities could be possible for an owner who owns West Ham. That is what makes a club self-sufficient, is by having that. Look at Leicester. They're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
This is what it can also do. So at this current point, the LLDC are running at a huge, huge financial loss. They need consistent events in the summer in which to try and cut down that bottom line of losses, which they're struggling to do so. I think they hit a bit of a good thing with the Major League Baseball, but that's only a 3-year contract. So they've had 1 year already. So you've got 2 more events they can do. So again, it's unless they can keep doing that, they can't sustain what's going on in the stadium. They've also committed that if they do not get a naming rights this year, by the end of 2023, they will have a more open and honest conversation with West Ham around naming rights. Now, the wording was interesting because it seemed very non-committal in terms of West Ham being able to help, because it came across as stating that West Ham are a bit more self-serving. It wasn't obviously put in those words, but the words were very carefully worded and framed. There was an acknowledgement that West Ham could help, but it needs to be beneficial for taxpayers as well as the club. And if we can get something like that, that'd be great. And then the most important thing out of the whole sequence was a point made as to, if someone come along with a big pot of money, would you sell? And without it being an unequivocal yes, the response was as good as yes, we would sell the stadium. The caveat, therefore, was, though, they would be looking to have a continual, essentially tapping the vein of the London Stadium. So for events outside of West Ham, international events, as it was termed, so this would be things like Major League Baseball, maybe NFL, concerts and so on that came into London Stadium, they would like to still see that go back to taxpayers, which in effect would be to go to London Legacy. So really, anyone coming in, as long as they were willing to provide a 5%, 10% cut of future revenues out off the back of that, also most likely with the real estate issue as well. It's anyone who comes in who is willing to offer not only a decent deal for the taxpayers in terms of taking the stadium and the burden, so that could potentially be saying they will take the debt, the existing debt on, which is substantial. I believe it's almost 300 million, I think, the debt on the stadium.
Yeah.
Plus buy it, you may be thinking maybe 400 to 500 on a stadium that costs 890 million pounds. Now that could be, be bought potentially, not obviously for that much money. I think it would cost a lot less, but essentially someone who's willing to take a financial burden off the taxpayers with a little bit extra, and then state that they will then give essentially a continual stream of money because they are buying what is essentially a publicly funded built location. They've got an instant legacy because of the Olympics. Someone can obviously utilize all of that heritage from those Olympics and that instant legacy, as well as with West Ham, utilize that to sell the location, to sell the area, and to drive international business into Stratford, into London. And if they're willing to provide a percentage back out, I think it's fair to say the London Stadium would be sold in a heartbeat if they got a reasonable offer, which is obviously fantastic for West Ham. But that isn't going to happen with Gold, Sullivan and Brady, because if it was, we wouldn't be 10 years down the line and still having the conversation as to could they now buy it.
So basically, after all of this, let's kind of just summarize before we keep going on. But we've got to a point now where that penalty clause has now gone. There is potential movement now in the summer where you mentioned there was those kind of financial restrictions. They could also be gone around June. So it's kind of all painting towards selling of the ownership, because they are also not interested in buying the stadium. They've made that perfectly clear with what you just mentioned, and it's basically set up for a big change this summer if it's going to happen now. So I mean, it's good news. It's good news if you're a West Ham fan, if you're just seeing this news for the first time. It's a small step in what could be a big process and a big change, but it is a step nonetheless, and it is something that we can kind of look towards as a positive, not only from who's owning the football club, but also what we could potentially do with the stadium in the future as well. So overall, I think it's good news. It'll be interesting to see how it develops in the next couple of months. Definitely something to keep an eye on up until June to see what happens. And yeah, man, it's an interesting development aside from the football on the pitch. So it's nice to talk about something other than the negative results. But yeah, let us know what you guys think in the comments about this whole situation, and whether you're kind of excited by it and what you would think about potentially new owners coming in the summer and what we could potentially do with the stadium as well. So yeah, that's going to be it for today. Make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. And Mike, one thing for us left to say.
Yep. Come on, you Lions.